In very explicit terms, the EPA acknowledges the development objectives, needs and interests of CARIFORUM countries and declares its commitment to poverty reduction, promotion of regional integration, the gradual integration of CARIFORUM countries into the world economy, its support for building CARIFORUM capacity in trade policy issues, as well as the capacity and competitiveness of its private sector, and the strengthening of CARIFORUM EU trade relations. Built into the EPA is the recognition that even in today's non-protectionist world of free trade, historical forces require that the Caribbean be given a helping hand in a more gradualist approach to competing in the global market.
The first agreement signed between the ACP countries and the European Union and into what we called European Partnership Agreements. The nature of these agreements, it's by nature, they are asymmetrical agreements, i.e. the EU is giving more to the Caribbean island than what we're asking to the Caribbean island to commit. So the EU is going to open up more than 90% or 95% of all the services sectors. But the Caribbean island, which have already made tremendous efforts, I must say, and we have to recognize it, will open, first of all, 70-75% of the sectors, but also on a more long transitional period. So some sectors in some island will be open to European providers only in 15 years' time. Some in 3 years' time. So depending on the speed where the island feel comfortable to open up the market. And that is something I think we have to recognize as asymmetrical, because it's not about European service providers coming and invade Caribbean island. But on the otherwise, we believe that we are comfortable to welcome all service providers from the island if they wish to come.
From January 1, 2008, our exporters are receiving duty-free, quota-free benefits into Europe for all goods except for sugar and rice. Europe has agreed to stretching out the process of trade liberalization from our end for their products into our market. So giving us an unbalanced benefit, meaning that we are being able to protect ourselves more.
Coming up, the framework for the new EPA and how it benefits CARIFORUM countries. The framework for today's EPA was established back in 2000. That was the year that Caribbean countries, as part of the umbrella ACP grouping with countries from Africa and the Pacific, signed what's known as the Cotonou Agreement with the European Union. Its aim was to gradually integrate the ACP countries into the global economy on terms that would reduce and eliminate poverty while contributing to development that would be truly sustainable.
Cotonou itself got our agreement that by the end of 2007, there would be a WTO-compatible agreement. So once that was enshrined in Cotonou, we had very clear before us a time frame for negotiation of an agreement, and we had very clear a benchmark that by the 1st of January 2008, a new agreement should be in place. What was unique about Europe is that you were dealing with products like bananas, sugar, and so on, where a whole range of developing countries had interests, where you had disputes in the WTO surrounding some of these products and so on. And it became obvious that sooner or later, you will have to abandon that route. In any case, there was no further European will to pursue a waiver after the experience of Cotonou.
There's a huge difference, however, between the Cotonou and the EPA treaties, which works to the advantage of the CARIFORUM countries.
The new agreement, as distinct from Cotonou, was intended not only to cover goods, Cotonou was limited to goods, but to cover other areas, for instance, services, investment, and a range of other areas that the two sides would decide upon. And this, in the end, brought in things like competition policy and so on, government procurement insofar as transparency is concerned. and a number of other areas. And that is the fundamental difference. Now, in terms of market access, that was broadened under the EPA as distinct from in the Cotonou Agreement.
In the case of the Caribbean, by and large, the smaller the territory, the more important the services to its domestic production, GDP, and its external earnings, tourism and entertainment, a couple other areas. So for the Caribbean, by and large, in spite of Trinidad and Tobago being a big oil sort of sector and so on, and the countries on the continent, Guyana, Suriname, etc., being mainly natural resource exporting economies, in terms of numbers, the bulk of the Caribbean was interested in selling new services. So for the Caribbean, it was not whether or not it should negotiate services, market access. The question was how much should we get from the Europeans rather than whether or not we should at all engage in services negotiations. So the mandate then was to include services negotiations because Caribbean had and still does offensive market access in service sectors.
The range of services that benefit under the EPA is very broad.
These range from financial services, business services, which itself is a really broad category, and that covers professional services, marketing, advertising, management services. All these things are covered, and these are things that would fall under the scope of an agreement. Then you'd have distribution services, educational services, transportation services, and we're talking about air transport, passenger transport, freight transport, and then other types, maritime transport, rail transport, and even pipeline transport, which is important for a sector like the energy services sector. You also have sectors like tourism, and this includes the travel agencies, tour operators, whether you want to go and establish a business in Europe or you just want to go and take a tour and bring a group over to any European country, or Europeans taking a group into the Caribbean. You have entertainers, which are important in this region, and the agreement opens services for them, different types of entertainment, whether it is the authorship, sound recording, amusement parks, circuses, you name it. Whatever is covered under that, that's also covered in the agreement.
The EPA caters for the variety of ways or modes by which services can be delivered from one market to the other.
For mode 1, this could be by electronic means. That means you're purchasing a service, you don't move, and the services supplier doesn't move either. So this can be delivered via the internet, and this could be an architectural plan. For example, it could be legal analysis on a document, it could be other type of research and analysis, whatever. Mode 2, which is consumption abroad. And in that arrangement, the person purchasing the service is actually the one that moves to the place wherever the services supplier is located. So the health and wellness sector uses consumption abroad a lot.